All right. Are you ready?
I'm ready. Are you ready?
Awesome. I am. Let's do this. Welcome, everyone, to Free Your Mind with Dr. Sheena Mason, where we talk about all things racelessness and my theory of racelessness. I'm here today with a special guest. We have been planning to podcast for probably something like 6 months, and we're finally able to align schedules and make it happen. So I'm really excited to have this conversation today with Amiel Handelsman. And I want to pass the mic over to you, my friend, to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Dr. Mason, Sheena, and other names that you go by. I am so happy to be here. And my name is Amiel. People often ask, how do you pronounce it? It's 3 syllables. And just a quick background, I'm coming to you from Ann Arbor, Michigan, where I grew up, left for many years, and recently returned with my wife and our 2 sons. And my day job, when I'm not talking about the topic we're going to discuss, is as an executive and team coach. I work with large companies, all companies, governments, over the years, foundations, all around helping teams produce better results while, as you might say, playing well together in the sandbox. And some people need more sandbox, some people need more results, some people need both. Some people need neither. In any case, that background I bring is how to help people work well together in organizations. And you and I met in, I don't remember the exact name of the event, but it's an event that our mutual friend Greg Thomas organized. I think it was called On the American Future, Combating Racism and Anti-Semitism Together. We were in the green room, so to speak, together. And so I was real happy that we were able to make a connection after that. And my wife, as I mentioned to you, grew up in a very small town just down the road from where you are in Oneonta in Lawrence, New York. And that was another reason I said, hey, I got to reach out to this professor.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be connected with you. And yeah, that was a really fun event. I very much look forward to doing more with Greg for a lot of reasons, but especially because he knows how to produce events.
Doesn't he?
So one of the sort of catalysts for why we're having this podcast is because in the limited amount of time that we've known each other, I've recognized you as what's called an eliminativist, otherwise known as a race abolitionist, or an anti-racist. Hopefully the pause was dramatic enough to demonstrate this spelling. And so in that way, we share something really fundamental in common. And some of the pain points that you might experience and some of the pain points that I experience are also shared. And so hopefully we can delve into a bit about how you got to where you are in terms of how you think about race and why. And also maybe we can touch on and explain to naysayers the difference between our positions and colorblindness, for example, and also talk a bit about who benefits from what we're actually advocating for. So let's dig in.
Cool.
How did you even get here? Was yours a windy path as mine was?
Pretty windy. First of all, I have to say that maybe the most fundamental difference that we have is the word eliminativist has too many syllables, and I'm not an academic, so I can't use it. But I obviously just used it once. But I know where you're coming from, because you got all these descriptions of different schools of thoughts, and it's important to be able to name those. And I think that's actually very helpful. So yeah, very short story. I was a senior in college 30 years ago, minus a few months or plus a few months. And I took a course called Race and Religion. That was the title of the course. And in this course, our professor one day handed us an article he had written. The title of the article was The Fallacy of Race. And the article blew my mind. It quoted Ashley Montague, the anthropologist. It quoted Anthony Appiah and a few others, and basically said this thing that we all take for granted, biological racial classifications, there's no there. There's nothing behind it. And wow, I almost felt heretical and yet freeing. So that was roughly January or February of 1992. Fast forward a few months, and I was like, okay, enough with race. Fast forward a few months, and I was actually watching this amazing movie, still a great movie called Boys in the Hood by John Singleton, the director. Oh, what a good movie. I'm watching the movie. I turn off the movie and turn on the TV in the commons room in my dorm. And the movie is about Los Angeles, and it's about fighting and gangs. And I turn on the TV, and there's riots in Los Angeles. And it's basically the verdict in the Rodney King, a man who was beaten by police, I remember 18 times or something while he was on the ground, came out and the police were let off the hook. They were not guilty verdict, and Los Angeles went up in flames. And so then I made I had this epiphany, which I've switched from, which was, how can you believe that race doesn't matter? Obviously, race matters. And it was only maybe a year later that Cornel West wrote a book called Race Matters. Now, the problem, as you and I know, but this elucidates a very important distinction, is that I was confusing a couple different ways people use the word race. I was confusing race as a biological classification, which is false. From a lot of times when people say race matters, what they mean is racism matters. It's unfortunate they use that term. Or the fact that people racialize and are racialized matters. So I was like, throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. If I'm here to pay attention, and I went to a vigil for Rodney King, there were like 15 people that showed up. So, the times have changed in some ways for the better, in some ways not, but at least people are showing up for vigils and protests. Very few did at that time. And I was scared to be there. I really was. I felt unpatriotic, un-American. I had all these inner critic attacks for showing up at an event that was basically protesting the police. I mean, it was really quite profound. In any case, I didn't understand that distinction. And I thought, okay, if I got to pay attention to racism, then forget about dissociating myself from biological race. 1992. There's enough, as we know, in our culture and society that says race is real, classifications matter. There's so many different reasons for that. So another 25 years pass, and I meet Greg Thomas, and in my first interview with him on my now belated podcast, he starts saying things like Black identified and so-called white. I said, what? And I realized, oh, he's talking the same language my professor did 25 years ago, except with him, I was able to figure out I can reconcile these two things. I can be against biological racial classifications while talking about racism and talking about how the ways that so many people falsely and unfortunately racialize. You can do both at the same time. And so that was very freeing. So I don't know if that was a winding path. That was like a get out of the starting blocks, fall down on the side of the track. I used to run track, sit around for 25 years. Someone hands you the baton and you're like, okay, he handed me the baton. I got to run with it. So here we are.
Wow, that was really interesting to listen to and in some ways witness. And a lot of it resonates with me because Anthony Appiah is one of the most renowned skeptical eliminativists who I admire deeply. And I guess the most fun I have sometimes is recognizing how my skepticism takes me even further than his skepticism. But he's still ultimately an eliminativist. And so regardless of how one gets there, and regardless of if you think that race is biological, then indeed it's certainly hard to feel compelled to eliminate it, because we've seen people try to do that, to eliminate what they perceive to be biological races, and how that plays out. But if you think that race is a social construction, and you do what you just described as sort of racism evasion, of saying constantly the refrain "race matters,"
Mhm.
and really what people mean when they say race matters is racism matters, it strikes me that there's something absent from the idea. And I think this is why a lot of people who engage with us on these ideas are hindered. It's not that there's nothing behind race. Racism is behind race. And that's the problem. And that's the problem that people would insist that you and I recognize, if they imagine and don't hear the point, or the fact that we say constantly and consistently that racism exists, and we're working to solve and resolve racism, which means that we're not saying racism doesn't matter or doesn't exist. And yet people, time and time again, that's how they interpret your words, that's how they interpret mine. Talk about frustrating, but I think one thing that can help us along this path is, instead of saying necessarily something to the effect of there's nothing behind race, helping people see that what's behind race are other things. It's not just racism for people, it's also culture, it's ethnicity, it's social class, it's economic class. And that misnaming, that mistranslation is what lends to what people perceive to be the value and benefit of race and being racialized, as well as the nefariousness and the violence of being racialized, and it's packaged all in one. And so the mountain that you and I have to climb is helping people see that the only thing that's lost with deracialization, with rejecting and refusing to racialize oneself, and as a nation coming together to say we reject this way of categorizing people as a supposedly valid and meaningful way of doing so, because we recognize that what hides behind race are these other meaningful differences that we can decouple from race, and we should, if we want to tend to the root of the problem, which is racism hiding its face as race. I feel like somebody needs to give me an amen in the crowd. that is the mountain that you and I have to climb, because somehow you say so articulately the problem, and you say, this was my journey, these were the conceptual errors that I made along the way, this is how I've come around really 360, and well, I should say 180 in some ways. We need more people to do that. But it seems like no matter what words you use, people still hear what they want to hear. Right. Do you experience that? Like, has that been your experience, or is that just me?
You've been doing this longer, and I think you've reached a lot of people who are a lot of folks, more people. You've reached more people, and I feel some of that frustration. I also want to speak, maybe make a distinction, is that the first reaction, if you're against racism, to somebody talking about racelessness, or my ebook is called The Anti-Race, Anti-Racist, ought to be, wait, which are you on my side or not? Like, that's an understandable reaction at first, because there are people saying we need to deracialize. And there are people who are saying, I've had enough of racial essentialism. Who, when they say that, they're saying, let's stop talking about racism. Let's stop tracking wealth inequality. The police are fine, or they treat everyone, whatever. Like, and I'm not saying the police are bad, but I'm saying we have reform to do, by the way. So it's understandable why some initial skepticism is there. I think that's important. I think it's a part of our responsibility to say, makes sense. Let me walk you through it. Now, by the 7th or 8th time that you've walked someone through the difference, and you've given 1,001 ways that you're against racism and see people's skin color, yada, da, 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 da. It's like at that point, then we're dealing with maybe an ideology. And it's hard there's just a difference between, I think most folks that I encounter who consider themselves progressive are fairly open-minded. And you have this smaller group that John McWhorter calls the elect, who are just rigidly ossified. And you got to climb mountains and I guess swim across the English Channel to show that you're in the right camp. So at some point, I just let go of that. But I think what we're speaking, at least who I feel like I'm speaking to, are the same kind of folks that took the class that Greg and I and Jewel Kinch Thomas taught, Stepping Up, for 6 months. We had 20 people, most of them were white identified, and they were all quite committed to what you might call social justice of a certain form. And we didn't even put this in the program description, I have to say, but because by the time we got 3 months into the course, we're like, we got to talk about deracialization. And so we kind of got into it. And what we found was that it was actually freeing for people. And when I say freeing, I mean, it freed up their energy to speak up about what they cared about, which are things that a lot of progressives would support, right? A lot of support. So freeing up the energy is a good thing. Now, there's some people who would say, again, this is coming from just a strict ideology, you're unburdening white people? What good is that going to do? Well, do you want people to take positive action in the world? Yes. Are burdened people likely to take a lot of action? No. They're likely to just hide somewhere and hope not to get beaten up, verbally or otherwise. So I guess the reason I'm saying this is that it's understandable why there's skepticism. And then there's a point at which if someone just isn't open at all, I say, let's just let it go. So I think our focus here, as I understand your invitation, is let's speak to the folks who are open-minded, but maybe skeptical. And let's get into this thing around colorblindness and how what we're talking about, it's easy to mistake at first, but it's really different. So if you want to get into that, we can get into that, or maybe you want to follow up with something that I said.
Yes, thank you. You listen, if you're going to keep dropping all of these nuggets that I then feel like, I have to lift this up and I have
you
to
don't have to lift it up
that.
though. You don't have to lift it up. Sorry for interrupting. I don't want you to feel responsible.
No, it's I mean that not in a pejorative way, in a very good and invigorating way. So a couple of things, like one of the aspects of doing this type of work and helping people grapple with racelessness in productive and meaningful and effective ways, you said the unburdening of white folks, and that might be leveraged as a sort of criticism. And indeed, I've been accused, admittedly only one time, by a troll on Twitter of being a coon, right? An Uncle Tom and all of that. And the same anonymous person, demanded that I take the video down. I can't remember which video it was, probably with Coleman Hughes, I don't know. And recently this week, somebody tweeted that basically making fun of me. They didn't tag me, but they popped up on my feed. So Twitter, it's great how that works. I got to see people smack talking about me without being tagged. And the person was like, oh, she's over here talking about her theory of racistness, and her account is followed by mostly white people. So that was a criticism. And then some really all the way close to the pole Black nationalists were telling me, you need to go talk with so-called white people about your theory of racistness. You don't need to be talking to Black people about it. So it's like, okay, what do you make it make sense? Okay. Racism is pernicious, and it impacts negatively everyone who's racialized. And in American society, and in plenty of societies, we're all racialized, which means it negatively impacts every single one of us. And as you said, some people are impacted in different ways based on their racialization, but the impact and the negativity of it is the same. And one of the hindrances to more people having meaningful dialogue as it pertains to racism is this constant and consistent insistence that people feel the burden and shame and all that stuff. And
Right.
I'm not a psychologist, and I would say that I am a person who's very in touch with human emotion. I don't think that those emotions are necessarily negative or bad, right, in appropriate context. But if we're sincere about opening the door to more people as it pertains to racism and solving it and preventing it and stopping it in its tracks, then the door has to be open to more people. So if the door to theory of racelessness is such that more people who otherwise wouldn't necessarily come through the door are coming through the door, it's interesting how that's not interpreted as a sign of effectiveness, right?
I want to say amen to that, though.
Yes.
Opening the door.
Yes, that's what we listen. That's what we need in order to start making the bigger, more generative changes that we say that we want. We need the door to be open. But if we just want to make it about politics, if we just want to politicize and lambaste people based on their politics and presume their racism based on their politics or based on how they're racialized or whatever, then that's fine. We can continue to do that, and we can continue to reap what we sow. And we can continue to therefore solve a whole lot of nothing. And in fact, help racism take root even further. And in terms of the distinction between something like my framework and your work, that I think is important that too many people miss, right? First of all, a lot of people, well, plenty of people look at colorblindness as denying the existence of racism because they interpret it as denying the existence of race, right? And it's this idea that a person's skin color can be interpreted into race, and then I'm going to overlook or ignore your race and treat you how I want to be treated. That's the premise of colorblindness. And sometimes, as you just beautifully outlined, sometimes that there are plenty of people who will take a colorblind approach and in doing so ignore the problem of racism, right? And even just refuse to acknowledge it, and in that way refuse to address it or participate in stopping it in its tracks. And all of that is hugely problematic. And you and I are facing racism head on, which to me makes it a clear distinction from that type of colorblindness, the sort of problematic one where I don't even want to say that racism has ever been a problem in the world or the country, right?
Right. Or that it was a problem and it's gone.
Right. Yes. Yes. And so we're facing racism head on. And so how people are kind of hesitant and concerned at first, I'm like, okay, that makes sense. But after I've directly spoken against racism in 10 different ways, and you're still holding on to something that I'm not saying, that's the story of my life right now, increasingly as my Twitter account it gets more traction. And I don't think it hasn't even been a year yet since I've actually been doing this work. So I don't know if I've been doing it longer than you.
You've had more than a year worth of attacks, insults, and false attributions. You've had a decade worth. Let me ask you this. Were you surprised? Like, were you expecting to get so much pushback?
Yes.
Or maybe you were, okay. So it's not that you were surprised, it's just unpleasant, to say the least.
That's right. Well, so one more thing, right? So colorblindness. Not only is it different because we're facing racism head on and we're actually offering a way that we can stop racism, that we can stop the persistent material conditions that people constantly point to, don't even fully understand more often than not, because their vision is clouded because of how racism works in this country. So I'll just throw that out there. I go into statistics and things in other podcasts, and people, if they really want to learn, can listen to those podcasts. But people have an idea of what racism is and how it manifests, and the idea isn't always accurate. And I take the ideas people have about so-called Black people as indicative and part and parcel of how racism works. And that's super ironic and paradoxical to me, because the people, usually progressives, who are self-proclaimed anti-racist and working really hard against racism, the ones who give me the most trouble usually on Twitter, those same people have these narratives of what racism is and how it has impacted human society. And it's clear to me by the things they say that they have actually no idea.
They don't understand the history in the least. I mean, that's one of the things when you can, if it's okay if I interject, when you study the history, you see, these collection of skulls, to compare beauty, and then to supposedly determine someone's intelligence by the size of their skull. I mean, you start to see these things, and you start to see how they were used to justify slavery and Jim Crow and all these other things. I mean, a little history goes a long way. So I do think it's important as an anti-racist to keep learning that history. I don't want anyone to be able to go, well, you're missing such and such. It's like, no, you're missing such and such. But let's get back to the same point. Let's get back to the main point. I really want to get back to this colorblindness versus racelessness. So here's how I look at it. And I'm just going to, because I'm speaking to you, I'm going to say it as though I'm speaking to you. I see your physicality, I see your shirt and your hair and your skin color and other features and your headset, which looks like a nicer headset than mine, by the way. But I have a good one, but I haven't brought it out yet since we moved. So, I see all those things. So first of all, I see those things. Second of all, I imagine, I don't know what your experience has been. We haven't talked about it, but I imagine that there are people in the world who see you and make certain assumptions based on and treat you in a certain way. It's fair to say. I'm guessing I don't know what your experience has been like, but that's what I would say. So I assume that. So in other words, I assume maybe there's some prejudice or discrimination or whatever you want, racism going on. I see that. I also see that we are not in separate biological races. We're human beings. We have our own ancestral trees. And the further back you go in the ancestry, the less genetics is passed down. So I see all those things. So I think for anybody questioning this, just listen to what I'm saying. You can do this with people. You can notice their physical features and name them, and they're there. You can acknowledge that a lot of folks look at those physical features, whether yours or mine, and assume something about character, intelligence, morality. We got to talk about athletic ability and my experience in track in a minute. You can probably end it. So there are people who are doing that. So people do that. We see that. We see how folks are racializing us. We see how people are treating us accordingly. And we also see that there are no there's no different biological race between us. It's all there. And there's a level of complexity there that stretches people's minds. But when you break it down like that, I hope some folks listening like, oh, yeah, I can do all those things at the same time. And I have to give this example on the athletic skill, because this was something that really angered me, and I'm not in an anti-racist moral stance, but I was 13 years old and I used to run sprints, and I had light skin, and you might say I'm identified as white. And I was looking at some old pictures because we moved, and you move and you get these photo albums. And there are all these pictures of me as the, the lightest skinned kid in these 50-yard dashes, 100-yard dashes. And that was all fine. It was interesting and competitive, and I did all right. And then when I got to middle school, I had this track coach who said to me, you shouldn't be running sprints. Why not? Well, you're white and you don't have enough fast twitch muscles, so you should run long distance. And I was thinking, and I was so angry. I wasn't angry because he was racist. I was angry because it was like, don't you see me? I'm fast. Yeah, as a 12-year-old, like, I'm fast. Now I ended up moving to middle distance, which created a lot of pain and suffering because the 800 meters is the most 2 laps around, most painful race you can imagine. I really wish I had stuck with the 100 meters, but now in retrospect, I see, man, that dude had some serious racist ideas, that is not founded on much of anything. And so I see that guy was racist. I'm telling everyone the story. You hear me telling the story. And yet I don't believe the biological points he was making. They're a bunch of baloney. There are differences between fast twitch and slow twitch muscles. That's real. But to say that this group has more of these and this group has more of those, it's more individual. It's not broken out like that. Now I have to ask our geneticist advisor, it's Tade Soia, he just sent me some of his stuff. So I don't want to go too far on the genetics. So I get myself into trouble.
Right.
Anyways,
because
yeah.
then skeptics will hear that and be like, no, racialized Black people are definitely faster. It's a proven fact. But Tade has been illuminating because I see him talking on Twitter all the time about when people make those kinds of arguments, and he pulls out his charts and data, and it's I will say that you thought the 800 was was gruesome. So I did cross country.
Oh, 800 meters. Yeah.
Track, right.
You did cross country.
I did cross country and I did track. And because I did cross country, my coach had me in the 3000. That is the most grueling, horrible, horrendous, running around a track however many times is not the same thing as running through apple orchards and things like that. So I absolutely hated it. I can't even tell you the blisters I developed from that. And when that coach got fired, it was like one of the best days of my teenhood, because then the new coach gave me the option and I went to 400 relay and 800. And oh man, I would take the 800
easier.
over the
800
3,000.
relay though. 800 relay or 800 meter open?
I did 400 relay and just 800.
So you did the 800 meter race and you thought that was better than the 3,200?
Oh yeah. But that's also because, I'm not a sprinter like the 100, 200. I can't say I actually ever tried, but anyway, digressing. It's just a fun fact. The other difference between what we're talking about and advocating for and helping people with is colorblindness still operates on the supposed existence in reality of race. It's the idea that I can look at you, I can translate how you look or your ancestry or whatever into race, and then I can somehow overcome those things and treat you as I want to be treated.
Right.
It's that translation, it's that mistranslation that my framework is intervening in, because it's the translation in the first place that is what allows racism to continue to persist. Because with the different racializations come different presumptions about who a person is and how a person is. And for people who are racialized as Black, it's they're more violent, they're more poor, they're more criminal, they're less intelligent, and so on. So there's literally nothing positive about being racialized in any context, and especially in the context of the US, where the idea of Blackness as a race and the idea of whiteness as a race, those foundational elements of race ideology that we have now today have been maintained. And we've tried to work from within the same framework, the same pernicious framework, to somehow get racism to stop taking form. But it's because we're working from within the framework that we continue to reap, again, what we sow. And we continue to be really clouded about how racism actually manifests itself here and now today. And it's not even, yes, it's about a deeper knowledge of the history, certainly all around 100%. That will always probably be the case in human society, because a person can't know everything, right? But they can try. But it's also about helping more people understand how racism manifests itself today, because the way that the media is set up, the way that the history books are set up, the way that our education systems are set up, time and time again, at every turn, we're taught to see racism in a way that's not necessarily matching reality. And that enables the problem of racism to continue to persist, because a lot of well-intended people are hitting their heads against the wall and perpetuating some racist ideas about racialized Black folks in particular, because of how this race ideology works, and really precludes more people from doing a deep dive into statistics, for example, economics, all of the various facets that people say systemic racism is still there. And they take for granted that certain ideas around the impact of racism today are true, so they don't do the research. And I find that to be actually a very negative impact of racism, which brings us to the question of who benefits from our work. Because if people have a clouded idea of what racism is and how it manifests, who actually benefits from that cloudiness? And I would argue it's not racialized Black people, the same people that a lot of people are professing to want to help. And so earlier we were talking about perhaps the benefit for racialized white people in exploring racelessness in more positive and generative ways and effective ways, because really that's about exploring racism in more effective ways. But one thing that people miss about my framework in particular is the benefit to people who aren't racialized as white. Not just because it stops racism in its tracks from a sort of white to Black instances, and I would say all of the directions, it does stop the external to the individual, but also too many people are taking for granted the reality of racism that they think is the reality that upon further investigation they find isn't. And that alone is liberating, because number one, you're kind of initially pissed off that you've been wrong about law enforcement, let's say, you brought that example up, or poverty. It's hard for people to recognize when they've been wrong about something like that, because the narrative is that sometimes I think some people think that all racialized Black people are poor, for example. But if you actually do the research, you come to recognize that at least the 2020 numbers, which are the most recent numbers that I found within the last few months, but I'm sure 21 is out. It was something like 19.5% of racialized Black people live below the poverty line. Well, okay, fine. So then people will say, well, they're still disproportionately more impoverished than racialized white people, even though racialized Black people represent a smaller percentage of the entire population. Okay, that's true, right? But that disproportion is, I think, exacerbated in the public imagination because of how racist ideology works and has its way with us. And one has to ask themselves, is this so if the disproportionality isn't what we're imagining it is, for example, and if the percentage of racialized Black people who actually don't live below the poverty line is so significant to be noted, right? Then what do we do, and how do we help the people who are still living below the poverty line, which is a far cry from the vast majority?
Right.
And
right.
then people talk about the wealth gap, which compounds this idea of Black people as poor, which is a racist idea about Black people. Might have been more true a century ago, right after emancipation, but even that, according to some economists, is an inaccurate assessment of the economics of earlier times. But even the fact that there is a wealth gap doesn't automatically mean that so-called Black people are poor. And so if we're creating
great point, such a good point.
If we're creating policies constantly with the race specific because we're convinced that it's racism and therefore the only way we can solve it is with race specific policies, then we're actually, the literature shows us, missing opportunities to help the actual people that we're saying that we want to help.
Can I interject? Because I think this is such a good point. So part of it gets down to, what is the end goal here? Is it to speak and talk racially and quote unquote combat racism, or is it to improve lives? American lives. Let's just talk about American lives. If the end goal is to improve American lives, then the question is, what's the best way to do that? And we right now have a political system that is caught in such a level of polarization and logjam. And there are many policies and incentive structures that would improve lives that we don't have enough support for because we're caught in this racial polarization debate. And this is why, as you said, the theory of racelessness and being an anti-racist could be very helpful to everybody, but including folks that are racialized as Black, because the current dialogue, the current rhetoric in the mainstream anti-racist movement isn't working. It's turning people off. It's creating opponents. It's creating opponents who consider themselves liberal and progressive. Like, I can't even speak up. I have to say the right thing. I have to prove my bona fides. And still you call me racist. Screw you. I'm done. Right? Is that what we want? So we have millions of people that are sitting on their hands, or as you said, banging their heads against the wall. But at some point you get tired of banging your heads against the wall. So you just sit on your hands and, stay away from the wall entirely, who are, disengaged. And in order to create policies and frameworks and organizations that actually deal with the real conditions of people's lives, what if the way to talk about those had nothing to do with race? I'll just give you an example. And this, I can make this point whether I believe in biological race or not. So, but what if passing around videos of white identified people getting beat by the police increased support for helping police forces reform, so that they, and it's a very difficult job to be in. It's a very difficult job to be in, but we can all get better. Okay, we can all get better. What if highlighting white identified victims of police violence, and there's a bunch on the internet, improved support for improving police that helped all Americans, including those as Black identified? My question for my most, hard-edged, progressive, anti-racist friends is, would you support that? Would you support showcasing how this phenomenon is more widespread, that it cuts across lines, if it led to the kind of results that helped everybody, including Black? And I don't think that's a question a lot of people want to answer. Let me address a different point you made, Sheena, which is around public perceptions of Black identified folks as being poor or disproportionately. First of all, we have to acknowledge the incredible progress that's been made. And that progress has not been, I'm giving you stuff, white folks giving Black folks. It's been a co-creative process of entering the middle class in massive numbers, right? We've got to acknowledge that reality to see people as they are. But the second thing is, they're in liberals and progressives who harp upon the negative. There is, if it's not racism, it's condescension embedded in that. And it's, it's a liberal condescension, a progressive condescension, which is, you all are so deprived, you're so oppressed. I'm here to help. Let me make it better. Tell me what I got to do. Because you need my help. I mean, there is just it's insidious, and I have seen it in myself over the years. That thought occurs to me, if not every day, every week. It's a thought that it's in the culture, right? So it's like, you're downtrodden. Whoosh, I'm going to come in and help you, and I'm going to show you that I'm on the good side of history. I'm going to say everything you want me to say until I get tired of beating down and hit my head against the wall and sit in my hands. But until then, I'm going to do that. Well, that in itself, for progressives, folks listening, it might be valuable to see how there's a lot of condescension in that. And Albert Murray, who's the thing brought us together, talked about there's not only the folklore of white supremacy, there's the folklore of Black pathology, which goes back to the so-called culture of poverty and the idea that there's something intrinsically wrong with Black Americans that is the reason they're in poverty. And you know what? I think there's a lot of progressive anti-racists who actually believe this without even knowing it. And it's so weird that you can consider yourself anti-racist, yet also think that there's something wrong about folks. But it gets back to your original point. As long as you believe that there's a white race and a Black race, maybe Asian and Jewish, you're kind of going to get caught in that. You might think, well, back in the old days, people thought that white was superior and Black was inferior. And I still believe that they're two races, but I believe that they're equal. Look into your thoughts and see if that's always the case. Because I bet if you're like me, I'm putting myself in this circle, you will find some degree of condescension. And you will find some thought pattern that goes like this. Well, let's see. I don't know much other slavery. All I know about is American slavery, because that's what most Americans know about, right? As though nothing ever exists. Well, let's see. White people did it. Black people suffered. There must be wrong with Black people, which is so screwed up. But this is another strain of progressive, call it a result of seeing these races. It's ahistorical, of course, because every color of skin and so many people have been targets of slavery and been enslaved over the years. And of course, African tribal leaders played a huge role in creating enslavement and enslaving capturing each other's tribes and enslaving them. So, but if you don't know that history or you ignore it, seeing that there are two races, you continue to fall into those mental abominations. Let's put it that way. In other words, what I'm saying is, yeah, keeping the notion of biological race intact and believing that you just see everyone as equal is not working so well. What do you think?
Yeah, well, for me, and I think this highlights a difference in our skepticism too. So for me, one of my core tenets for the theory is that race is not biological, nor is it a construction. And it's because, it would be probably impossible to actually measure how many people think race is biological versus how many people think it's a construction. And we know that a lot of people who feel it's a construction still construct the thing around skin type, phenotype, skin color, phenotype, ancestry and all of those things. And so the differences are muddied, which is why it seems that most people, or too many people, believe still in it, but being biological, but really they would call it a construction. And constructionism falls woefully short for that reason and more. It's because if you view it as real in any way, which constructionists, they'll say things like race isn't real, but yet it's real because it has consequences. So that's the same as saying it's real. Newsflash
I'm with you on that.
to constructionists out there, right?
I don't disagree.
And so the difference that my theory makes is that it's not biological and it's not constructed. The social construction is racism, but which is evidenced by some of the aspects that we were talking about earlier in terms of what hides behind race, or what people mistranslate into race or as racial. And because we were on the topic of the sort of nefarious ways that people are impacted by race ideology and the cloudiness in terms of what they think about, what they believe to be true as it pertains to statistics and the current 2022 status of what racism is, what systemic racism is, what people would call white supremacy, all of the things. So I actually wasn't encouraged to look up these numbers until last semester. So the fall semester, for folks who are new here, I'm an assistant professor. One of my classes and I were talking about all of the different aspects of all of the things as it pertains to racism. And with the class, we looked these things up. And ever since then, I've been paying really sharp attention. And actually, my discovery of these numbers is what led me to actually do more research and investigation into other ideas that I just presumed were true, such as I thought that certainly a higher percentage of racialized Black people were poor based on the narratives that the media would have us believe, and based on anti-racist circles and conversations that I had with people. I didn't have in mind, oh, it's 50% or it's 70% or anything like that. I didn't have a percentage in mind, but I didn't know that that was actually a far better picture than I thought it was going to be. And so that was a happy discovery. Well, the same is true for the information on law enforcement. Now, this information isn't me saying that there's no positive change that can happen, that reform is absolutely unnecessary. I believe, as a human being that I am, one of my strongest characteristics is the fact that I'm always willing to be wrong. I'm willing to prove myself wrong, as clearly evidenced by my journey through this sort of race ideology and my anti-racist efforts. And therefore, I always believe in continued growth and learning and improvement. And I hold myself to a very, very high standard, a ridiculously high standard. And my wife could tell you that. So I believe then that every profession and industry and discipline and all of the things and every aspect of human societies can be improved and should be improved in some different ways. But or I should say, and I think that being more clear-eyed about what is what as it pertains to racism and as it pertains to problems that are identified by the media and thereby the public, we need to be more clear-eyed about what the problems are before we can do anything else, before we can advocate or improve. And part of how racist ideology works is it precludes us from being clear-eyed about what the problems are. So if I look at, we won't look at 2022 because we're still in the middle of that. But for 2021, these are the numbers of police-involved shooting deaths of people based on their racialization, and I would say Hispanic is an ethnicity, but we know that the US government conflates those two things. So this is a breakdown. The unknown, the green, is suspicious to me. I will say that. But you see the breakdown. Now, this is also, if we're being clear-eyed and astute and unbiased, this isn't, oh, well, automatically so-called white people, that number is higher. And so-called Black people, you don't have anything to complain about. No, because we know that racialized Black people comprise something like 13% of 100% of the US population. So why are they so heavily impacted here? Well, something else this chart doesn't tell us is the number of shooting deaths that were justified, where officer was actually protecting someone else from losing their lives or protecting themselves from losing their life. And a lot of the narrative around police shootings and law enforcement and this demand for defund the police and reform are as if shootings are never justified. But I would argue that self-defense or defending the life of somebody else, absolutely, I think it's justified. And so these numbers tell us nothing as to the circumstances, and it's easy to just assume that all 139 racialized Black people represented here in this number, that all of those people were wrongfully shot to death. But I would say, no, that's probably not true. And even if we say that, okay, well, let's say that 50%, that's being generous, that's being really generous, probably. Let's say 50% of 139 people, of those 139 people lost their lives in this manner. Let's say that that 50% was unjustified. Well, that's, I'm not a mathematician, that's about 69, 70 people, right? We're talking about, even in total, without considering if it was justified or not, we're talking about less than one person a day in an entire year, right? But the narrative that I see people pushing on Twitter and media and so on is that Black people are getting hunted in the street by law enforcement. And now also racialized white people, which people often conflate with law enforcement, and that's the whole thing. But it's like, that's not even the reality. So then I ask the question again, who's benefiting from so-called Black people believing that is their reality? Who benefits from that level of fear, anxiety, passing on that ideology and that fear and that way of thinking to their children? Who benefits? And if we look at prior years, right, because that does matter. If we look back, okay, 241 in 2020, 235 in 19, 209 in 18, which is, if I remember correctly, that's before Floyd, 223 in 2017, and that's all that this chart is showing us. But you see a pretty consistent pattern, with the exception of 2021 being probably a record low in terms of racialized Black people. Again, that green is highly suspicious. But yeah. I would have to believe that for that green to be even a majority of racialized Black people who, for some reason, the government decided not to identify as being Black, the media would have been all over that like sharks, because what do they like to do? They like to promote racist ideology. They just do. And if you lean left, you say, well, if you lean left, you think of law enforcement interactions like that, and you think of police brutality, and you say it's racism. If you lean right, you say, no, it's because Black people are more criminal because they're inferior in that way. And so that's why they have more negative, more interactions with officers. And that's why they have more negative interactions with officers. And if you lean left, you say, well, that's probably true, but it's because Black people are more poor. And so when you're poor, you're desperate. So you're more criminal. And so, and that poverty is caused by systemic racism and white supremacy. Where? If we look at the numbers, which we're not encouraged to do if we continue to think within race, ideology and frameworks, if you actually look at the numbers, you come to find it's eye-opening. And guess what? It's liberating. And it's liberating for racialized Black people who believe certain things about themselves and how they are valued or undervalued in this world, in this nation, that goes against the reality on the ground. And again, I ask for all of the naysayers and all of the people who are saying, how does the theory of racistness or any idea of racistness, how does that impact material conditions? Well, which material conditions are you talking about? And if you're including anywhere in there the social class aspect of it, then you would recognize that people being cloudy on how racism is and what it is and where it manifests and how it continues and how to stop it and how to free themselves from it, you would recognize that as an essential part of your anti-racist efforts, period. I can't tell you how many of my students who are racialized Black students, how many of them have told me how free they feel because they're slowly but surely getting more clear-eyed about what racism is and what it isn't. And before they were in my class, they were basically taught to think the exact opposite. And they were taught to feel that they didn't belong anywhere, that nobody wanted them anywhere. Wow. You know what I'm saying? Like, what is Leonard Harris calls it?
So important. That belonging is so important.
Leonard Harris calls it necro being. There is a social class aspect of this that is not the same as the economic class aspect of it, as relayed by some of my information I gave earlier, that continues to wreak havoc on people, on families. And never mind the fact that the shooter in Buffalo, listen, I do believe that racism is going to always exist. I believe that because racialization happens in different ways in different countries and different contexts. And that's how you have a situation like World War II, where the Jews were racialized as a different and distinct race of beings. And then the Nazis tried to annihilate them based on that racialization. So you have racism that's not Black and white, as Americans often presume it always is, that exists in other places, right? And we can say all day that that's just part of humanity, that's part of human society. Fine. So humans like to be evil and vile toward each other. Fine. Okay. I don't think that we can absolutely prevent 100% something like what happened in Buffalo recently. Or any of the countless other examples that we could point to where it is or was racism, right? But it doesn't have to be the way that it is now. And racism and all of the nuanced ways that we've tried to at least open the door to through this too short conversation, it impacts people on many levels in many different ways. And there's nothing positive about being racialized. And part of the negatives of being racialized is being precluded from seeing more clearly oneself in relationship with other people, especially those who don't look like them. And it's all bad. There's nothing positive about it.
Let me just piggyback. So there's a couple really, what you just said about your Black identified students and the feeling that they have when they learn this is really, really touching and really, really powerful. I hope everybody heard it, because it's, if people are saying, well, what good does this do? Well, how do you measure what good it does? You introduce it to actual human beings and you see the impact on them. That's empirical. Now, it's not a scientific study, but that's very powerful. And the second thing I want to say is, if I'm a member of a group that has been told I'm less than human, I'm less than American, there's something wrong with me. If I learn, damn, that was based a bunch of crap, I'm going to feel like, finally, I'm being appreciated and recognized for where I belong. And I bring in the word American because another unfortunate dimension of the extreme anti-racist ideology is to say that there's Black America and white America, and they're like separate. And there's a historical truth in terms of economic exclusion and political exclusion. And yet, it's time long past time to recognize that all of us who are Americans are American. And in fact, some of us, Black identified Americans, a large proportion have been American a hell of a lot longer than other Americans. And that's why this is a topic of another conversation, but you know how we switch from saying slave to enslaved people? Well, I've been saying enslaved Americans, at least after a certain time period, maybe, 1776, because just because you've been fucked over and abused and brutalized, you're American. Now, a lot of folks will say, oh, that's as long as you acknowledge that someone is American, you're denying all the suffering. I'm not denying the suffering. I'm acknowledging the contribution to building the country physically, culturally, economically, all of the above, militarily. Stick your adverb in. So, you know what I'm saying? So anyways, I just needed to piggyback on, because of what you said, the direct, visceral, practical impact on your students who identify as Black and how it has them experiencing themselves. I'd be very interested, somebody out there listening who's a scientist would study where they go in their future the next 10 years and do a longitudinal study of Dr. Sheena Mason's students compared to someone else's. I'd love to see it.
That made me giggle. Yeah, there's so many ways in which racism is internalized, and I'm recognizing more and more that when I talk about the internalization of racism, I think people hear that I'm talking about, the internalized hate for oneself based on how a person is racialized. And I think that's certainly part of it, but I will say that most racialized Black people that I've met in my life and that I know don't hate themselves and don't hate other Black people.
Don't hate being Black. Right.
Right. Usually it's like extreme pride, in being Black and so on and so forth. And so it's not that, it's the internalization of the messages about racism and who a person is in the world or in this country that are part of the tentacles of racism that have woefully negative impacts on said people, including how a person relates to the nation. And it's funny because some people, I think, humans tend to think in pun intended, Black and white ways about a lot of things, because who has time to to know nuance or to think critically, even though we say that we promote critical thinking. I think people prefer some easy and neat and straightforward ways of seeing things. And that's unfortunately true as it pertains to racism and actual complex happening and phenomena.
That's the theory of race fullness. That's a different topic.
So I think one of the benefits that gets missed is people do the thing they would accuse me of doing, centering whiteness. They do that when I say the theory of racelessness helps people free themselves from racism, because they look at it in only the sort of black and white way. And they miss, number one, they miss intra-racialized group dynamics and problems, which was the impetus for my research and care in the first place. Had nothing to do with racialized white people, first of all, which people constantly miss because they're doing the thing they think I'm doing. And there's actual value in the here and now of freeing oneself from internalizing all of these things, while still being able to recognize in a more astute and clear-eyed manner the existence and problem of racism, and more importantly, how to solve it. And that's another huge benefit of any of this, because if we're more clear-eyed about the problem, then we're not distracted or putting energy into the wrong side of things, or into areas where that's not really where the problem is, right? Or more specifically, that's not where race-specific policy making or solutions is actually going to have the impact that needs to be had. For example, when it comes to economics, okay, And so if we're more clear-eyed, then we can actually have a bigger impact on the people we're thinking that we're helping and sticking to this race ideological way of seeing the world. And what you said about Americans, so that's something that really resonates with me. And it has been a very long journey for myself in terms of how I viewed myself as American and all of the different aspects of the journey. And admittedly, it's been a painful and a long one, just as it's been actually painful and long of a journey to get to where I am as it pertains to race and racism. But it's been hugely beneficial, and that's something we share because people like Trevor Noah, he points out in one segment that it seems as if Americans are the only ones who don't recognize how they hyphenate and divide what it is to be American. And, you know, to outsiders, people in America are simply Americans,
right?
when you're traveling. But from the inside, it's hard to see that, and people view it as a necessity to carve out and point out distinctions and all this other stuff, which upholds the idea that to be American is to be white, and a lot of people would say male. And while that idea of American was true historically based on who had the right to vote and who was counted as a full human being, for example, it's not true in 2022. I would say it was never true then, because to your point, other people who didn't have the full rights of humanity or citizenship at the time still contributed immensely to the creation of what would become America and what is America now. And separate
Absolutely.
is not equal in this instance, as we know, because of the problem of racism. And so long as we continue to insist on hyphenating or otherwise separating or qualifying Americanness, then it's my sincere belief that we will continue the quagmire that we're in. And what I advocate for is recognizing American as reflective of all of us, with the differences and distinctions that are usually regional, also often economic class-based, that are there, because American has never described some sort of homogenous or monolithic, way of being, because that's not the nature of this country. It never has been, and it never will be. So the sooner we stop being cloudy as it pertains to all of the ways in which we identify and all the ways that we should probably identify in the future that would be more productive, the better all of us are. And the work that you and I are doing is part of what opens the door to those other avenues of exploration, such that my students I had 3 years ago, even to my Teach for America days in Houston, Texas in 2012, I'm still connected with those students. I'm still connected with their families. And they tell me on a regular basis how they could never go back to thinking the ways that they had. And that even though they found it to be initially hard, intellectually, spiritually, emotionally, my students have called it, that it was immensely positive and generative and freeing for them. And they're glad that they had the experience, because not everyone can take a class with Dr. Mason, right?
I love that. I mean, it does. I had two people describe, I did a talk to a group, half of which was in South Africa recently, and a few people who loved the talk said it felt like I was pulling the rug out from beneath them. And that is the initial feeling. It is unsettling. It ought to be. It sounds like that your students had that experience. But, some rugs are, I don't know, moldy and torn, and they ought to be removed, So, I just commend you on that. Something else I realized that I more fully today about the nature of what you're offering is it's complementary, but it's not the same thing as racelessness, is like looking at reality as it is, looking at the facts as they are, from the data that you showed on the screen to these dimensions of history. I just think that's so valuable. And it is an antidote to the confirmation bias that anytime something happens in the news, I automatically have a story around it and it goes right in that story. And you're saying, look at the facts, right? So I think that's refreshing, and it is, it helps once we have the facts in front of us, we can make our interpretations of them and actually focus on how to make things better. But if we're living in a dream world, two things happen. Number one, we don't know what problems to solve. And number two, living in that dream world as it is now in the anti-racist world is reducing, I'll use the word allies. It's creating a lot of opponents. So
Amen.
that's, anyways, oh, I got an amen from you too. Cool. Now it's been a successful podcast conversation.
Indeed, we've come full circle.
Yeah.
Amiel, I want to open the floor to you to say any other sort of final words of wisdom or nuggets that you want to share with listeners.
Share my final words of ignorance and obliviousness to the world. Well, I'm not looking at the YouTube feed or anything like that, so I don't know what kind of comments you're getting. But I want to just say to everybody who's giving Sheena an extremely hard time, there's a lot of other really smart, good-natured people out there to give a hard time. You know, share your vehemence, distribute it more equitably. So I want to say that. And second of all, I'm just thrilled that we're in this conversation together. It's, to me, I think of it as wrestling. It's a wrestling. It's a metaphor of, this is not easy. I'm not speaking with great truths. I'm sharing what I'm learning, and you're sharing what you're learning, and we're constantly, self-correcting. And I just look at this as an invitation to everyone listening, just like join us in that exploration and that wrestling. And really the final thing I want to say is, there's this tradition in the United States known as pragmatism, which to simplify a complex thing is do what works, right? And so if you're having questions about how valid is this, how much good versus ill could this do, I say to you, try it on yourself, right? When we go to the store and we buy clothes, well, some of us like to shop quickly and get in and out, but others of us want to try the clothes on for size and see if they fit. So it's like, try on the theory of racelessness. Adjust your language, adjust your thoughts, listen to news stories differently, see what that does for you. And I expect if you're like me and Sheena, Dr. Mason, and many of our students, you might find over time some positive benefits. That's my closing line there, Dr. Mason.
Thank you so much, Amiel, for joining me today. I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. I think there were several amen moments throughout. So we definitely need to do this again. I really appreciate your time.